serf runs away, and they manage to not get caught for 366 days, you know, you're free. You're good. And in Russia, they kept expanding that. So it was like, you know, I don't remember the exact numbers. If someone remembers, feel free to correct me. But it's like, you know, okay, let's change it to 2 years. Okay, let's make it 4 years. Let's make it 8 years. Yeah, we're just gonna make it so it's never. And that was the other thing I saw, especially because, you know, when we contrast what's going over, you know, by the Atlantic, you're seeing this gradual, like, the peasant class stops being peasants in the way that the things going on there.
Thank you. Remember in England, for instance, in the wake of the epidemic of plague, 1381, I think, there was a peasant revolt, Wat Tyler revolt, if you know history, when landlords tried to cage peasants in a similar way, like they tried to do in Russia 300 years later. But at that time, they were not exactly successful landlords, because peasants in Western Europe, in the wake of this epidemic, when the social life, economic life was disrupted, they were able to carve freedoms for themselves, because there were no centralized states in Europe. Okay.
Yeah, there was that lack of centralization. The other thing, this is from my medieval Europe class with Dr. Graham, but it was like sort of like a shift in values, like after the Black Plague, because all of a sudden, like, peasant labor started being valuable because there weren't as many of them. So that's, you know, they started to see themselves as valuable. Like, hey, wait a minute, I should have rights. Whereas, you know, we're looking at like post-time of troubles, you know, it's not that there's not a lack of peasant labor, there's a lack of safety. And so that's what people ended up flocking to. Was
That's something I was actually gonna ask, because I remember I was doing some research on like the Black Plague, and like something that kept popping up is that like essentially people who had like who would have felt like moral obligations to like return to the system before ended up dying first, because if they were like considered to be good people at the time, they normally were like, you know, like helping other people or not like taking for themselves. Like in the plague, good people tended to die first because they would be taking care of like sick people. So like, does that also like add something to like this in Russia, where there's just like people who don't have any like obligation to the land, like within themselves, like want to like come back, and that's why there's such like a big like shift or like a difference in the way that there was like stuff happening with like peasantry in like Western Europe after the plague, and now there are like small towns forming of like warrior peasants who just want to work for themselves now.
See, that's what actually I'm trying to explain to you, the different venues. Russia and Western Europe went different venues. See, there's a similar situation, but different consequences, because again, we are prisoners of contingencies. Okay? There is certain, like the lack of centralized state and the existence of centralized state in Russia. The fear of lords in Russia of the centralized state. Okay? In Western Europe, the peasants developed this strategy. They played one lord against another lord. And that's how, because the labor was valuable. So they could run around, they could escape to another lord. Okay? It was very hard to do in Russia, because if in the wake of time of troubles, lords tried to do this game, they could be penalized, okay? See, that's the whole thing. Another interesting thing here is that in Russia, still, Russia was an expanding state, okay? So it did help to solidify people, it kind of like a safety valve, okay? Because Ivan the Terrible started expanding to the east in the 1600s, and we're going to discuss this next week probably, expansion of Muscovite Russia to the east, grabbing these lands, okay? And centralized states started to commission people to go and to seize Mongol lands, you know. So the people were colonizing the eastern lands, but they were replicating this Mongol system, okay, again and again, the centralized system. So that is why I have problem with, it's another issue, of course, you didn't mention it, but I have to bring it up. Sometimes people compare colonization of the American West with colonization of Siberia. They look superficially, they look similar because the populations were involved in similar activities, but they were totally different phenomena. Okay, in North America, it was pretty much grassroots movement. Okay, there were different powers in addition: Spain, France, United States, Russia actually came there. They were competing with each other. Okay, in Siberia, it did not exist. Okay, it was the state-sponsored colonization. Okay, so I guess here we have to emphasize this. Okay, statism. Okay, everything was sponsored from Moscow, and we're going to discuss next time, I think. I call him Siberian Cortez, one of the Kazakh leaders. I'm not going to give you his name right now, we don't need. So he received the sponsorship from the government, okay, when he occupied particular Mongol lands. Okay, he asked permission of the Tsar to conquer these lands. It's another interesting thing. So different circumstances. Again, to summarize, in Europe, serfdom was going down. People were getting freer and freer. Oh, I forgot to mention another element, which I think Brazel mentioned, the existence of towns, right? Remember, I think you briefly mentioned. See, in Russia, towns were not empowered by charters of liberty. Since Middle Ages in Europe, towns were able to carve for themselves certain freedoms, okay? And those peasant serfs who escaped to towns, even before epidemic plague, if you stayed there a year in Central Europe, you were considered free, okay, in towns. If the Lord couldn't claim you if I escaped to a town. There was a saying in Germanic kingdoms at that time: the town air makes you free. Okay. Actually, it could be used as a metaphor, you know, in all respects, because towns did give, like, they became spearheads of science, right, education, printing, and all these things. But in Russia, towns were totally subjugated to the governmental control. So the Tsars didn't give them any charters of liberty. Okay? So there was no way for a peasant to stay in a town to get freedom. The only way was to go to the south and join these gangs of Cossacks. But here is the problem. Remember at the very end of the last conversation we had here, remember how Russia handled Ukrainian Cossacks? They started to buy them, okay? They started to turn them into separate estate, giving them privileges, registering them, okay? So there was no way right now, by the middle of the 1600s, for peasants to join these communities, because these communities could turn them in, because now they became the bodyguards of the Tsar, okay? Yes, they were free people. They had the farmsteads, you know, unlike peasants in Central Russia and other areas. But they were, you could use the word corrupted, just to make it understandable. Or their loyalty was purchased by the Tsar, okay? 80% of Cossacks. And that is how there was no way for peasants to find a leeway. Some of them continued to escape where? To Siberia, to certain remote areas, but it was very dangerous because Siberia is Siberia. You know? No wonder it was used as a land of exile later. So, if you were a single person without any family, you could try this project, you know. But with their narrow parochial worldview, peasants, not many peasants were able to do it, okay, because the worldview of peasants was limited by village borders. So,
I just wanted to ask something about serfs. From our modern perspective, we use the term essential personnel during the COVID heights of COVID. And
Essential
these
personnel.
people were supposed to go to work no matter what,
Uh-huh.
because we had to have them working.
Yes.
And it turned out they were the lowest paid people that we have, but they were the ones that were essential personnel. Managers, CEOs of corporations were not essential personnel. And so what we see here is that peasants discovered through all these processes that they were essential personnel, and the lords knew it. And so they were trying to get their essential personnel come back for substandard wages, doing dirty, dangerous work.
Everything old is new again.
That's my point.
I like how you put it. I never thought about it, but it does look similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, peasants were essential personnel. Serfs were, because they couldn't avoid, right? Labor. They were forced to labor. All right.
Is the Lord going to go out and push a plow?
CEOs, of course, they can't push the plow. They need essential personnel. Okay, so we mentioned some of these things, a few other things. The state continues to reward gentry or lords. It's a synonym. Remember, the lords, gentry, they serve the state. That's the whole thing. In Europe, lords did not serve the state. That is why peasants had more leeway. So here, if I'm aristocrat, if I'm a CEO, like you said, so I depend on the state. But in Europe, if you are a CEO / lord, you acted as a Google. So you couldn't disregard the government, you could shut down anybody, or you could elevate somebody, like, because in Western countries, traditionally, monopolists came to exercise more power, unlike Eastern countries, where the state became the major role player. I'm simplifying the whole story, but just to make it clear to us.
I have a question. In the Helly article, he keeps talking about the middle service class, and how the serfs had to support these people in order to free them up to do whatever they were doing. How does this middle service class fit in with all the other groups we talked about, the boyars and the aristocracy and those? And what is their layer in there?
Okay, so there was a third minority class, so-called burghers. City residents, craftsmen, merchants, whatever, skin tanners, repair people repairing something, who held workshops in Moscow and some nearby towns. But it was a tiny group of people. Okay, it was tiny compared to Europe. Of course, not many towns existed in Russia. Okay. Their role was not as significant as the role of peasants and lords, but they did exist. Later, their number increased by the 1700s because of technological changes. So they were crowded in a separate estate. I'm glad that you asked me about it. So the name was Meshchane. Meschane, M-E-S-C-H-A-N-E, Meschane, burghers, essentially, city residents, okay? So that's how, and clergy, don't forget about clergy, they also had to be supported. In fact, clergy possessed a lot of peasants. They were clergy. Church was one of the biggest landlords. Monasteries, churches, they owned peasants. Peasants were serfs. And that's what later became this kind of apple of discontent, because the state wanted to subjugate the church, to put it under control, to make sure that the church would not exercise its own economic influence. Okay? And later, under Peter the Great, some of the church lands, monasteries' lands, were confiscated and granted to aristocrats who worked for the government. Okay? So essentially, there were 4 estates by the 1700s, if we jumped ahead. It's lords on the top, peasants on the bottom, in between burghers and clergy. Okay. Kazakhs. We don't forget about Kazakhs. We have this artificially created group, border guards. Okay.
So five?
Five. Okay, we talked about Kazakhs. Okay. I don't need to go there. Again, to summarize what Brazel told us, so the number of no return days was shrinking. And that's what I tried to get from you. Okay. So that's the law уложения. Уложение, it means prescription decree in a literal translation. Уложение in translation from Russian means prescription decree. So what is prescribed for peasants? How it's prescribed for them to behave? So essentially this law shut down the loophole. Peasants still had a week time to change the master during so-called St. George days. Now everything was shut down, and that's how a popular Russian saying originated. It goes like this. Here is your St. George Day, my friend, you know. So if something bad happens with you, if, for instance, I want to come and the door is shut in front of me, people don't allow me to do things, you know. If they silence me or something like this, that's when this saying is used. And here is your St. George Day. It means the government shut down your right to change the master. Blocked, closed the door. Okay. So no right to leave anymore. No status of limitation. Before, there were, like Brazel told us, there were, you could spend as an escapee for 7 years or 5 years, you could be free if a landlord couldn't find you. I don't remember the exact number of the years. And later, the number of these years was expanding. So the government said you have to stay as an escapee like for 10 years or 15 years. Okay. And eventually shut down any possibility. So no place would make you free in this case. Essentially like what I can compare this law with what they adopted in the United States in 1850, I think, right? That's the Dred Scott decision, right? Of course, it's a superficial. Can we compare this, or it's hard?
Well, someone wrote a whole book about it, so I'll let you know.
Because here also you could escape, but you had to be returned, right?
Yeah, it was.
So there was no place unless you escaped to Canada.
Yeah, the Dred Scott decision was basically, the idea that just because an enslaved person got into a free state didn't mean they were automatically free. Their enslaved status carried over with them.
Yeah, same as here. For instance, some people who escaped to Siberia, potentially they had to be returned. It's another matter, of course. It was hard to reach out to them, but potentially they could be taken back. You wanted this?
I'm having trouble bringing it back up. I read something recently. No, it's
That's
not.
okay. No
Sorry.
problem. So what essentially we have here, we have serfs turning into slaves. Okay. That is why when you describe Russian serfdom, yes, it was serfdom, and on many occasions people still had to be sold, gifted, not separately, but with the land. But after this law, some lords started to sell peasants separate from the land. More and more cases we see, which by the end of the 1700s became a widespread practice. Again, we're not talking about this, it's a Catherine the Great time, so by 100 years later, it became a common practice when some peasants were could be sold without land. So it means you acquire status of a slave. So that is why we have to write this, serfs / slaves. That was the status of Russian peasants after this war. Okay. Okay, here is another interesting thing. Since the state was powerful, Muscovite state was very powerful. So the state itself, the Tsar, was a big landlord. So there were many peasants who belonged to the state. So they were state serfs. Majority of peasants were subjects of landlords, particular landlords. Okay. But we see 30–40% were so-called state peasants. The status of state peasants was better, much better, historical. You can guess why. Because the Tsar had to hire different managers to supervise them. And as you know, if you increase bureaucracy, they have no personal stake into this. They just work for the salary, they fulfill their job, and they leave. But landlords who owned peasants, they were more anal, they were supervising peasants. They were trying to squeeze all the juice from their peasants, okay? It's clear.
Isn't that like Amazon?
To some extent, see, you try to find the current analogies, yeah. Well, you know, you want to compare Amazon with the state, right? Or with the landlord? Yes,
with the slaveholder.
Slaveholder. Yeah. Why? Because Amazon is a huge company. So I would rather compare peasants who belong to landlords to some Chinese restaurants where the Chinese people exploit their compatriots, you know, who work there for 14 hours.
Oh,
Amazon reminds me of the Muscovite state because it's a huge monster, like it's Frankenstein.
Amazon also kind of works as the church.
Amazon
also kind of works as the church too, because a lot of people who work in Amazon did like sign up for it at one point. Like, there's some volunteer stuff, but then they regret it after.
Yeah, which gives me, by what you just mentioned, gives me another a chance to say something. See, of course, we're playing these games, comparing the stuff with Chinese restaurants or with Amazon. But don't forget, here you couldn't opt out. With Amazon, with the Chinese restaurants, we can't opt out formally.
Well, to be honest, that almost seems like it's edging away from not being true, concerning in the news there was that thing where Amazon was trying to put up doing like towns around there, so around their facilities, so workers wouldn't have to go home anymore.
Yes. Here. Here we already acquire workers acquire the status. I'm not going to use the word serfs, but they become tied, right? If you have a town, you have to shop in Amazon stores.
Yeah.
You go to Amazon schools, everything is so you become a prisoner of the corporation.
That's the way old mining towns used to
Yes,
work.
correct.
The mining company owns the town as well as the mine.
Yeah.
And so everything you got, you spent with company.
Groceries you have to buy
Yeah.
a store that belong to the company.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good example, by the way, that kind of takes away some of your freedom.
Yeah.
Formally you're free. Yeah, you can actually, you can drop out. You can jump in the car and drive to New York, not New York City, but New York State, because you cannot get into New York City. It's blockaded right now by different restrictions. But you can go to Alaska, you can go not to Canada, because Canada is also shut down. Alaska or some other places. But yes, your example is good. You know, I accept this example. Okay, what do we have here? Okay, and that's when peasant commune becomes very, very important for the state. State and landlords begin to use peasant collectivism peasant elders become responsible for paying financial dues. Okay. So that's when collective responsibility was introduced after this law was adopted. If somebody escapes, doesn't want to be a serf, if somebody doesn't want to pay money, or taxes, originally of course it was treated, the rest of the people are responsible for him or for her, okay? That's how it worked. So that is why it was hard to escape, because you could put in danger your relatives or fellow residents who lived around you. See, Michael, the first Tsar, the founder of the dynasty, and his son Alexis, they ruled a long time. The power of boyars, remember, boyars were aristocrats who temporarily, during the time of troubles, raised their heads, tried to get freedom, and now again they were put down. Don't forget what Ivan the Terrible had done with them. Okay. So now aristocrats were totally crushed, they couldn't exercise any influence, and we have, when I say aristocrats, hereditary aristocrats who could trace the origin to Kiev and Russia, the lineages, okay? So we have a bunch of new aristocrats, gentry. That is why we use the different word, just to let you know that since Ivan the Terrible and later we have new aristocrats coming to power, being granted land estates, working for the state. They didn't have power, they worked for the state, for the Tsar. The Tsar, at first, Ivan the Terrible gave land grants to the members of his Praetorian Guard, Oprichnina, okay? And Michael and Alexis continued doing this, okay? They rewarded loyal people with peasant villages, with land, okay? So we have new aristocrats who were obligated to work for the state, either as military officers or as clerks, okay? They were not allowed to live in the land estates. That was the rule. Okay. Why? Because first it was dangerous to allow the new aristocrats to stay in the land estates, because they could spread the roots, they could entrench themselves somehow, they could be idle. That's what Tsar said. They could plot, conspire against the central government. So they had to work for the government. Okay. It's a major signature approach of all absolutist regimes. Remember Louis XIV in France, he did the same thing. He in fact brought many aristocrats to his palace in Versailles and assigned for them different jobs, even made up jobs. You know, some of them carried his pillows, others carried his slippers, whatever, just to be close to him. Shogun in Japan, Shogun in 1600, same time. Remember, Japan, checks and balances, had two centers of power, the emperor and the shogun, commander-in-chief. So shogun, whose power was on the rise, he was afraid that aristocrats, feudal aristocrats, could kick him out. So he forced aristocrats to live with him 6 months. The rest of 6 months, they were allowed to stay in the land estates. You know? But at the same time, samurai who worked for the lords, they were obligated to spend with shogun the other 6 months. So in this case, he could keep an eye on them. See, it's in many areas of the world people were doing this, okay, trying to keep an eye on aristocrats. Another interesting thing, okay, since the time of troubles, in the wake of time of troubles, government, the czars, introduced an interesting position, military governance. It's a very characteristic of what regime was doing. Military governance. In the newly conquered areas, in the south, the Cossack lands, in the east, especially in the east, in Siberia, newly attached districts, they were ruled not by the civic civilian government, but the military government. Okay, so-called voyevoda. In a literal translation, carriers of the war, spearheads the war. Okay, but the better translation will be military government, which was understandable because they were capturing peasants with troops attached to them. They were chasing peasants who were escaping to the south, to the east, trying to blockade them. They ordered people, trying to line them up on many occasions. It was easy to handle people by relying on military governments. Okay. They could order burghers in towns to do something. Okay. In England, in Russia proper, and central Russia, yes, you could order burghers, but at least you could ask their advice. The small group of people. You could not decree them. You have to be mobilized and produce, let's say, 10,000 coats for some kind of musketeers or something. Okay, so these coats had to be purchased. But in the southern Russia, in the east, in Siberia, military governments could order these people, and these people could not object. So see, it's very handy for the government to rely on military governments. It's another element of a growing autocracy. See, towns, as I said, had no political power, were not commercial, financial centers. No guilds, no banks, no joint stock companies. In fact, I have to be more precise here. Such things hardly existed, for example, in Southern Europe, except some Venice or Genoa, okay, a few towns. In Spain, for instance, we don't have them either in the early 1600s. Okay. In Austria, we hardly had them. In Germany, they did have them. It's only in Northern Europe, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, England, that's where we have these things that kind of prompted the development of commercial life. Okay. But in Russia, there were the first bank, actually, commercial bank was created in Russia in early 1800s. See how long it took for the country to kind of to go in this commercial, to start developing commercial life. I would like, okay, second part of our conversation. So I would like to say something about spiritual life of Russia during this time. This important element. Remember, we just mentioned autocracy, and one more time, autocracy. So centralizing state. Part of the centralization was an attempt to standardize church, standardize the church requirements, prayers, standardized prayers, standardized rituals, standardized books, church books. Okay, and this guy, patriarch, archbishop, Nikon, spelled as Nikon. Nikon, it's pronounced in Russian Nikon. So he was put in charge of this job. What was the goal? The goal of this guy who was promoted by the Tsar, Alexis Romanov. Nikon was expected to go to the original Greek books and eliminate all distortions that developed in the process of assimilation, of the assimilating of the Russian church to the Russian soil. Remember, each doctrine, when it's grounded in some indigenous soil, if a doctrine comes outside, it acquires naturally indigenous features, right? Religion, for instance, if you move, like, there's a bunch of evangelicals right now in Western Africa. It's a very popular religion. It's another reason why. But they're similar to American Southern evangelicals. But at the same time, it's a very different because they injected into evangelical church that comes from England, from America, their own African elements, okay? Peppered evangelical church, evangelical movements with the African elements of African culture. Same thing happened here, okay? For example, books that had been translated from Greek into Church Slavonic by different people, they contained a lot of mistakes. And some of the rituals, they were based on these mistaken translations, okay? Because, remember, education did not exist as a system in Russia, okay? There were hardly any educated people. There were few in Russia, okay? And many translations were mistaken translations. One of the major complaints of Nikon and his reformers who wanted to standardize the church was that, look, originally you had to make a sign of the cross. It's a big deal in Greek Orthodox Church. Okay? When, for instance, in Russian cabins, peasant cabins, you entered cabin, so you have to face icons, remember icons, and you have to make a sign of a cross. I forgot how to do it. Yeah, this way, this, and this. Kneel down and make a sign of the cross. Since I don't belong to any religion, it's hard for me, you know. I apologize, you know, I did not learn this well. You know. Some people do it automatically, you know, like everything. It's amazing. I watch sometimes Catholics or Orthodox or others, or here Southern evangelicals. It comes from your family. It comes from your family. I was neglected by my parents, you know. They raised me in a kind of secular guys, you know. Unfortunate, I don't know, you know. It depends on your preferences here. Anyway, but in Russia, they made the sign of the cross with 2 fingers. See? Because of a mistaken translation of some Greek books. So essentially this conflict that started as 3 fingers reform against 2 fingers old way of making sign of the cross escalated into attempt of old loyal members of Orthodox Church to keep the tradition, to keep the church independent of the state. Okay, that was the desire of these people who wanted to preserve these mistaken rituals, mistaken sign of the cross, you know, because they thought it's our tradition, that's how our ancestors did things. And but the bottom line here, they didn't want the church to be dependent on the state. Okay. Some people, some recent historians, I read some works on this movement, on this protest that became known as old believers movement. Old believers movement. That's how it became known. So those who didn't want to accept standardization reform, they became known as old believers. Old believers. Some historians call them a Russian Protestant Reformation, like abortive Russian Reformation. They say that, some historians, that this was an attempt to do what Martin Luther had done in 1517 in Central Europe. Remember, Martin Luther came up with the same idea. He said that we need to go to old books. We need to stick to the to the old rituals. In Europe, it was a bit of reverse. Here, old believers said, we stick to the existing rules. In Europe, Martin Luther said, we are going to Hebrews, we are going to old books. Roman popes are evil, Satans. Because the Roman popes introduced these rules. So they forced people to be subjected to the power of the Roman popes, who are not mentioned in the Bible, and that is why legally they have no right to exist. You know, that was the message of Martin Luther, and that's what split Europe in 2 parts. Here, similar to some extent, but not exactly, because here Nikon, reformer, said, let's go to the old books, okay? But these folks, old believers, wanted to stick to the existing rules. But still, since they wanted the church to be independent from the state, that is why some historians call it the Russian Reformation, because the major message of Martin Luther was the same. He said, every man is a minister, we don't want to be dependent on any centralized authority. That is why Protestant movement became heavily decentralized. Same as here, all believers were a bunch of decentralized communities, and they have different rituals, by the way, because in different parts of Russia, they developed in the course of time different rituals, okay? Different types of prayers. So there were like hundreds of these old believers. They were unanimous in rejecting the state authority, but in particular traditions, they differed from each other, because in the local areas they developed their own approach to Orthodox Church. Okay. Their leader was Archpriest Avakum, a very zealous guy who was ready to sacrifice his life for this old belief, existing belief. Schism happened, the church separated in two parts. And all believers, they began escaping from towns, villages, and that's what added another element to this protest, because some peasants who didn't want to stay in the villages as serfs, they joined this movement, which upset the government very much. So basically all believers set themselves against the state, because by default they were inviting people to escape to remote areas, escaping this satanic church. They call the official church satanic church. See, it's a recurrent story in each religion. They, where different groups accuse each other. They say, I know the way to God, and other groups say, no, I know the way to God, and they begin to kill each other. Shiites and Sunnites, or Catholics and Protestants. In secular religions, by the way, in secular ideologies, people do the same thing. Communists were killing social democrats attacking communists, okay? So don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to promote some kind of zealot, atheistic zealotry. I see atheists who behave as Jesuits. Because they're so zealous in their atheism, they try to impose it. Okay, science is everything. You have to, there's scientific consensus. You have to stick to the science. And what is science? Where is scientific consensus? Science is not based on consensus. Science is debates, where each group of scientists has a right to say something about it. So to be careful about secular religions. Again, my skepticism goes beyond religion, kind of. In this case, I have to touch upon the secular guys, although I'm myself a sort of agnostic. Okay, no need for priests. All believers said, we don't need priests. It's very similar in this case with Martin Luther, who said, we don't need priests. Although Martin Luther also was rebuked by some radical Anabaptists who rebuked him for saying, every man is a minister. Because Anabaptists said, what about women? What about children? They also can be ministers. I didn't mean it. So he opened the Pandora's box. Here, with all believers, they said everybody could be a minister. So that is why they had the women who read the Bible, preached, the males, even some teenagers. They became educated people. Okay? Historically, this group of people became fixated on studying the books. So let's read the Bible in Church Slavonic, not in Latin, not in translations, because it's evil. Our Bible should be all Church Slavonic. And there was a bunch of old believers who wrote comments for the Bible, how we should interpret the Bible. So they were very big on this, trying to read these books. And they had homeschooling, they taught each other how to read and to write. So no wonder that later, much later, by 1900 in Russia, these people became the first spearheads of commercial life. They joined the group of burghers, they became educators, they became merchants, they became accountants, because historically they were more educated than peasants or other classes of Russian society. Makes sense? Same thing like in Europe, in Northern Europe. I always tell students why Northern Europe became so advanced, because they have more educated people than Southern Europe or the rest of the globe. Because there was a huge pool of people from where you can recruit educators, engineers, inventors, you know, and that's how it works. See, if you, since I jumped far ahead by 1900, I want to mention that by 1900 there were about 12 million old believers. So they already became a separate religious group, confessional group, who didn't want to associate themselves with the existing estates. They lived in borderlands, in Siberia and southern Russia, away from the state.
Are there still people that consider themselves old believers?
To the present day, yeah. They're very powerful. See, it's the importance of the family, because everything tradition is transmitted in the family. The communists tried to break it, and they did to some extent, but not 100%, because old believers survived communism, still exist to the present day, which shows this resilience of tradition. Okay, especially when it's transmitted within a family. Okay. But it's amazing how family is important. You know, even those people who reject. You know, for example, there were some. I'm jumping ahead. There were some old believers by 1900, educated old believers, who rejected the religious doctrines of their grandmothers, grandfathers, who became revolutionaries. There were a lot of believers who became Bolsheviks. Interesting, but they became zealous Bolsheviks. They promoted zealously communism, trying to impose it, to say that it's inherent in humankind, you know, we need to impose the total equality, and that's how it is. They were very big on studying the sacred books of Marx, Engels, you know, the communist books. So if you study things as a historian, you see that rejecting quote-unquote religious ideals of their ancestors, they were still religious people promoting the secular religion, being anal about the ideology. It's amazing. There's a book about this, what I'm just telling you, it's not, I didn't make it up. There's a book published by a UK historian, forgot her name, it's called Old Believer Bolsheviks, something like this. So she studied biography of rank and file Bolsheviks, and she did find out that a lot of them came from the ranks of these folks. I'm sorry, somebody wanted to ask something?
You mentioned that a bunch of these old believers escaped to the north and the Siberia.
Yes.
So I mean, are those areas heavily populated with these old believers?
Yes, to the present day. Borderland areas. See, by the time we're talking about 1600s, we have this pure religious zealotry, and some of them in protest wanted to commit rituals, sacrifices, so they set themselves on fire. When governmental troops arrived to arrest them and bring them back, because they had among their ranks a lot of peasant serfs, runaways. On many occasions, they set themselves on fire, like these Buddhist monks that protest against Chinese Communist government. You heard about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there were 10 years ago, I think 10 years ago, there were dozens of Tibetan monks who set themselves on fire because the Chinese government wanted to squash Tibetan independence.
When I was reading this, I didn't understand. Was that in one event? Did they get together and burn themselves all at once?
Yeah, in the village of old believers. Yeah, it's a typical case described in literature when a village of old believers they committed what Jim Jones did in 1977, People's Temple. I remember the guy who was a socialist, by the way, because he thought American imperialism was chasing him. He escaped. I'm not making it up. He escaped to Guyana. And when the people from Congress and the reporters came there in 1977, they thought that the government was after him. And he asked his supporters to drink Kool-Aid. Not Kool-Aid, or some kind of poison. Yeah? Kool-Aid.
It was cyanide.
That's how this expression. You,
Drink the Kool-Aid, yeah.
Yeah, drink the Kool-Aid. That's how. Yes, exactly. All believers did the same. Only instead of drinking Kool-Aid, they set themselves on fire. Okay.
But these were in separate towns.
Separate towns.
I see.
Separate towns. Oh, here we go. This. All right. For some reason, there's a bunch of
He's holding up two fingers.
bullet points here, but they disappeared. That's okay, you know. I mentioned already. So this guy, Avakum, he was arrested by the government, exiled to a remote area in the north, in the fort, guarded by troops, and he was kept in a dug-out hole in the ground, okay, like a dog, basically. And lived there in this hole for 10 years, but did not back off, committed to his, zealously committed to his old beliefs, okay? And eventually he was burned at the stake, okay, by the government in this case, not himself, but by the government. So he promoted this two fingers. There were other people, prominent people. One of his major supporters was an aristocrat, one named Morozova. She was a rich woman who belonged to an old boyar lineage. And she openly challenged the government, and of course, she was immediately arrested because not only she was dangerous by promoting these two fingers, ignoring, criticizing reforms, but she was an aristocrat. It was an additional danger for the government because she challenged the government. Remember how Moscow government was suspicious of aristocrats who tried to behave independently, you know. So that is why it's a famous episode when she was arrested and put on the slave and exiled to a remote monastery and kept under heavy guard. And eventually she was either poisoned, I forgot, or strangled or something. So the fate of these people, old believers, was tragic, of course. Okay. But here's another twist. This guy, Nikon, who did the reform, who imposed this standards, new books, new rituals, new prayers that should be the same from north to the south, from Baltic Sea to Black Sea, same rituals. He felt so empowered. He started doing the same thing. He wanted to behave independently from the state. And that's what the Tsar didn't like. So when old believers were squashed, a new conflict arose between the reformer and the Tsar. And it was natural, because he became very popular. Remember, at that time, people were thinking in terms of religion. That was their major identity. Okay. Except being loyal, I told you once, except being loyal to a village, to a Tsar, the major identity was religion.
So did this guy become a saint? I mean, was he canonized as a saint?
Yes, he was. There's a bunch of saints, you know. Of course, I don't remember their names, you know, but he was the saint. And Avakum late also was declared the saint. So he was also exiled, but he was not treated as like a dog, unlike Avakum, who openly challenged the state powers. So he lived in under house arrest.
Was he trying to create a church state within the political state?
Say it again.
I'm not sure how to say this. Was he trying to form a religious-oriented state that was within but separate from the political Russian state.
He wanted to make sure that the church had much to say about the government. Okay.
Okay.
But under Alexis, they took a different course. They decided to eventually create the Department of Religious Affairs. That's what Peter the Great eventually did. And of course, church was appalled by this. You know? So the state wanted to completely subjugate the church. Okay.
So did exiling him strengthen the old believers perception of things? Because it's like the guy who's in charge of designing or standardizing this religion is
You did your job, now you can go, basically. That was the approach. We don't want you growing your charisma. We don't want you to boost your power. Okay, that was the message. You know, you are not evil, but we don't want any contender, any competition. Because Louis XIV, Russian czars, they also repeatedly said, "I am the state." Remember, Louis XIV pronounced this famous phrase that became like a signature approach of each absolutist monarch. "I am the state." So here we have the same story. You know, the czars repeated this phrase, and that was their approach. They agreed with this approach. And by the 1700s, we can talk about Russian absolutism. By 1700. So we will continue this story. We will, next time we are going to talk about expansion of the Russian state to the east and how it boosted autocratic power. All right, so is it time to stop? Let me see the time. Okay, I'm done, so let's leave at this point.